Good afternoon, and welcome to today's event, Shakespeare's Place in America, an interview with Joseph Haj, sponsored by Shakespeare America. Today's event is scheduled to wrap up at 6:30, but after an hour or so, we will take questions from the viewers. So if you have a question, just enter it into the chat at any time, and when the time for our Q&A arrives, our production manager, Finley, will read it out for us. Joseph Haj is a leading figure in American theater, and you don't have to take my word for it. He was characterized as such way back in 2014 by American Theater Magazine. That was a year before he became the 8th artistic director at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. Prior to that, he was the producing artistic director at Playmakers Repertory Company in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And he should be very well known to local Shakespeare enthusiasts because of his distinguished work as a director at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. In 2012, he directed on the outdoor stage a production of Henry V with John Tufts in the title role. In 2014, in the Thomas Theater, he directed a production of Pericles, which by word of mouth, I would say was one of the most beloved productions of the last decade at least. And just last year, 2 years ago, I guess, in 2020, he directed a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream in the Bomer Theater, a production whose run was cut cruelly short by the COVID crisis. It was supposed to run, I think, 9 months. I don't think it ran more than 2-3 weeks. Very sad. Yeah. Very sad. Joe actually began his career as an actor, as an MFA in acting from University of North Carolina, and he went on to work with, as an actor, to work with such acclaimed directors as Peter Sellars, Garland Wright, Joanna Akalitis, and Bogart. Sir Peter Hall. He was actually for 2 years a member of the acting company at the Guthrie, the theater he now heads. As a director, he has helmed productions, leading regional theaters across the country. In addition to OSF, he's directed at the Folger in DC, the Actors Theater of Louisville. And beyond those sort of high-profile gigs, he's directed inmates at a maximum security prison, production of Henry V, actually. He's made theater with a rural community in South Carolina, and he's conducted workshops in the West Bank and Gaza. At the Guthrie, his directorial output among many productions includes a couple of Shakespeare plays, King Lear and Romeo and Juliet. The latter preceded a production of West Side Story that Joe also directed that went on to become the biggest box office hit in the Guthrie's history, which is quite an achievement. Among his many accolades are the Zola Ficklander Award, the Rosetta, going to my cheat sheet, Rosetta Lanois Award, did I get that right? And the NEA White House Council Millennium Grant, which is awarded to the country's finest artists. Welcome, Joe Haj.
I'm so pleased to be here, David. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here so much. So I wonder, before we kind of tackle the big question about Shakespeare's place in America, I wonder if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit more. I mean, I gave your sort of professional bio there, but I'd be really curious to know at what point you became involved with the theater and at what point you knew you wanted to make it your career.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks to folks joining today. I'm honored to be here with you. You know, I'm the child of Palestinian immigrants. I grew up in Miami. Theater was just kind of not a thing in my, it wasn't in my line of sight at all. I don't know how old I was before I saw my first play of anything, let alone a professional production. And I was very much an indifferent student. Nothing interested me in any way ever. And my senior year in high school, I signed up, you know, in the way, I don't know if it's true now, but it was then that in the senior year, there were a couple of requirements, and then you had elective classes that you could take. And I signed up for a first period drama class because it seemed like an outstanding thing to sleep through. And I had that one great teacher. I mean, I really did. It was that kind of that one great teacher. And I just loved it so much. And, you know, all of the pain and of loneliness and everything that's going on as a high school person. the theater was such a place, a safe place, an appropriate place to wrestle with and deal with some of those thoughts and some of those feelings. And anyway, I caught the bug late, but I caught it deeply. And while it made no practical sense to me to think that I could have a career when I literally didn't know one person on the planet who had a career in this profession. And in Palestinian life and amongst a Palestinian emigre community, you basically have there are four verticals. You could be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be an engineer, or you can be an abject failure. And these are kind of your options. And so, I had parents who didn't understand it, of course, at all, even as I was coming to understand it only in tiny bits. And so in college, I wanted to study it, and I did. Went to community college, then transferred to Florida International University, where I took my bachelor's degree. And I just knew that I loved it very much, and I knew that it made sense to me in a way that almost nothing else did. And also, I knew that I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything beyond feeling that I was interested in it. And so I went to graduate school. I was accepted to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as you mentioned. And it's really there that I became, I learned how to train. I learned some of the professional skills to become a professional actor. And of course, Shakespeare was a big part of that training. But I'll say, I was so far behind my colleagues. I was in graduate school and I'd never read a Shakespeare play front to back in graduate school. I mean, it's embarrassing to say that now, but I just didn't have any background in it at all. So there was a whole lot of catching up. And I had a roommate called Michael Kumpstein, who was one of our great Shakespeare actors. And I remember trying to read Richard II. I don't know why I picked up that as my first Shakespeare play, but I remember sitting with Richard II, and I read those first several scenes, I don't know, over and over. And I finally turned to Michael, and I'm like, I don't get it. I don't understand a single thing that's happening here. And Michael just explained to me everything that was going on. And I was like, oh, okay. And I went back, and by the time I got to the end of that play, I thought, who writes like this? How is it possible that anything could hold so much? And I kind of fell in love. And when I went to grad school, I thought I'd be trained. I wanted to be an actor, and in those days I thought I'd go to LA and I'd try to make my career in TV and film. And it was really through the graduate school experience that I kind of fell in love with Shakespeare and with formal text. I'll say one more thing autobiographically, and I'm sure I'll bore everyone senseless, but my father was blind, and so I grew up, and he was a huge reader, and he would get books in Braille from the Library of Congress, and then in later years he got cassettes on tape, etc., as things changed. But I used to read to him all the time. So even though I was a terrible student and school was just of no interest at all to me, I always loved words. I always loved language. And so there was much of Shakespeare on reflection that just made sense that I found myself there ultimately,
Mm-hmm. Well, you were obviously a really good actor. So at what point did you think, no, it's directing is what I want to do?
Yeah, I was becoming the kind of actor that every professional hates, which is to say, I'd gotten to the point where I was very fortunate. I worked a lot and with a lot of wonderful folks. And I got to the point in my acting career where I got tired of explaining plays to bad directors. I just did. And I found myself turning down work a lot of the time. And it was my now my wife, then my girlfriend, who turned to me and said, look, if you don't think anybody else knows how to direct plays, you probably ought to have a go. Like, you probably should, figure that out. So, and so I began directing.
Interesting. And I know you've said elsewhere that Garland Wright, whom you worked with, was a particularly influential person in terms of your artistic trajectory, that you worked with him just for, I think, just a few shows. He really was just instrumental in your development as an artist. Could you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, it's funny how somebody's impact on one's life is not necessarily corollary to how long you spend with them. I did 4 shows for Garland, and I was a member of the Guthrie in those days. This is 30 years ago, had a standing acting company, and I was a part of that company for 2 years. So I did probably a dozen plays across those couple of years, 10 or 12 plays, 4 of them directed by Garland, but all of them under Garland's tenure as artistic director. And I think Garland was one of this country's truly great artistic directors, truly great, a magnificent artist himself. And what he believed in the theater and what he believed the theater could do was striking to me. And long before I ran the Guthrie, there would be hardly a day that would go by that I wouldn't reflect on something Garland had said or had shared how he thought about in ways that were hugely influential to me, hugely.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, maybe we should turn to the big question then, which is, Shakespeare's place in America in 2022. And I'm curious to know how you would answer that and whether you think it's changed in relation to the past and not just the distant past, perhaps even the recent past. There was a question posed in an article in the Washington Post lately to the effect of, do we need Shakespeare anymore? And how would you answer that?
What do we need? I don't know. I'm not coy on the question. I just think it feels complicated and it feels foolish to me in any number of ways. I mean, do we need Shakespeare? I don't know what that means. I mean, I literally don't know what that means. What do I think with Shakespeare, frankly, so you have several questions in there. Like of course it's changed, and what we need in examining those plays in 2022 is different than what we needed 10 years ago, and it's different than what we needed 50 years ago, and it's different than what we needed 200 years ago. And of course, the genius of those plays is it could bear any era and any approach. There are many, many, many ways to think about these plays, and there are many ways to produce them. But outside of the Academy, the proof is simply in the pudding. Do we need them? Like, do audiences want them? Well, if they didn't want them, they wouldn't come. And at the Guthrie, and this correlates with my experience at Playmakers Rep as well. The Shakespeare plays, outside of the musicals and for those theaters that do A Christmas Carol, Shakespeare sells as many tickets as anything else you're going to do in the theater. So there's audiences for these plays. Does everybody love it? No, but everybody doesn't love anything, anything. So, there are people who would rather die than see a musical. There are people who right? So, I mean, it's a matter of taste and opinion. But I would say that really the proof's in the pudding. If it didn't mean anything to anybody, nobody would come. So I obviously they still have things to say. And obviously there are still audiences that feel their own joy, their own entertainment, their own growth, their own provocation through those plays. And I think there are a lot of folks that do, and I think there are as many folks who do as have ever done. I mean, there's an enormous audience for these plays. Yeah.
Well, in terms of the changes that you see in what kinds of obligations or constraints doing Shakespeare leads to now, is it the case that there's some different way that we now have to approach Shakespeare?
I don't know. We have so many orthodoxies around these plays, almost all of which bore me enormously. I mean, I think that you can do Shakespeare a lot of ways, right? You can do it with 10 maximum security inmates with nothing, as I have done, and you can also do it with millions of dollars of resource, as the Guthrie provides when we do one of these plays. I would say there are a lot of theaters that would frankly do a lot more Shakespeare, except that they're big if you want to do them at scale, and they're very expensive to produce. A very, very interesting statistic. In 2018, and this maybe is about classic writ large, David, more than Shakespeare specifically. But in 2018, TCG did a survey of the field. And for the sake of counting, I don't think they were making any moral statements, philosophical statements. For the sake of counting, they said anything 50 years old or older, we would call a classic. Anything between written 50 years ago and 10 years ago, we will call a revival. And anything within the last 10 years, we'll call a new play. And let's look across our member theaters and let's just see what's being produced in this country. So in 2018, they looked across a field of some just short of 400 theaters across the country, some 2,086 productions, looking at everything that was produced in this country that year. On that scale, and members of TCG, which is the service organization for the not-for-profit American theater. So very roughly speaking, most of our large institutions in this country are not-for-profit theaters, are TCG theaters. They looked across that whole field, those 2,100 roughly productions. Only 12% of everything produced in the country in 2018 were plays 50 years old or older. And of that 12%, 40% were plays by Shakespeare, leaving some 7 or 8% that were classic plays. And when you think 50 years, this isn't just like, the super old dead guys like the Greeks or even Shakespeare. This is most of Arthur Miller. This is most of Tennessee Williams. This is all of Beckett. This is Pinter. This is all of Shaw. I mean, it's astounding how little, when people are like, oh my God, those old plays, let's not do them. The fact is we don't. It's one of the biggest lies in American theater is that we spend all our time around these classic plays and where are the new plays. And I have a lot of, I could talk about it for hours. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, not least of all, dead playwrights aren't around to argue for themselves. They're agents and there are new plays and they're being pushed all the time as the better work. And those new plays and our the way we fetishize the new in this country and societally, as if the only good ideas are the ones that people living and writing and making today are the only ones who have anything to say about anything. And it's the astounding narcissism of our time. And I think it does us colossal damage. And again, not just Shakespeare, but we have a lot to learn. By going to classics and folks who have been there before, whatever it is we're dealing with, including the plague that we have just lived through. I find it in a modern scholarship, very contemporary scholarship may have it differently. This is years ago when I was acting in Troilus and Cressida. I came upon a fascinating academic note, a research note, which said that prior to 1926, there had never been a production of Troilus and Cressida in this country, which is astounding when you think of how many small Shakespeare were crisscrossing the country and all that was going on. There wasn't a single production prior to 1926. And between 1926 and the early 70s, there were only a handful of productions, all of which proved to people how terrible Troilus and Cressida was and that nobody should ever do it. And then the Vietnam War happened and everybody understood that play. Everybody understood it. There are no good guys. There are no bad guys. The whole thing's fucked. And we all got that play. And as is often the case, we find that Shakespeare was there first and understood something we didn't understand. And I could talk about 100 plays that have that kind of resonance in today's world that are worth viewing again. You look at Lillian Hellman's Watch on the Rhine about the rise of fascism, which she wrote 70 years ago, and that thing feels like it was written yesterday in terms of what is being explored. So I think the classics have a lot of value, and they have a lot of value for our contemporary life. For sure, they do.
I was just thinking about. I've heard you on another occasion talk about the Persians by Aeschylus and how you would hate to sacrifice that in deference to a contemporary anti-war play. Not to exclude the contemporary anti-war play, but that you wouldn't want to dismiss Aeschylus.
Well, look, I don't think we'd have to choose. I wouldn't want to say you must do Aeschylus and you shouldn't do whoever's writing the magnificent contemporary anti-war play, to state the obvious. But wow, is it idiotic to dismiss Aeschylus as somebody who's examining that question? Sure, I'm sure there is some playwright who has never been anywhere close to a war writing a really great play about a war. We don't have to live and experience to write about it. But in Aeschylus's case, he fought at Marathon. He fought at Salamis. He lost a brother in one of those wars, fighting by his side. That guy came out of that war and he wrote a play about war and its experience, and through the lens not of the victors, which was the group to whom he belonged, but from the loser's point of view. It's funny that that's our first play, existing play. It's the first one we have in Western drama, and it has politics. Through at least one sort of reading of that play, it's an anti-war play. So it's both our first play and our first anti-war play, which is to say the first play that we have in the Western drama is a social justice play. It'd be idiotic to go, well, it was written 2,500 years ago, and so we shouldn't pay attention to it. Maybe there's something to be learned from the fact of a war veteran writing a play centered from his own experience. It's hard for me to be persuaded that we should eject these plays because they don't sit most comfortably in terms of the social mores of our time. And sometime 2,500 years from now, people will be laughing at the idiocy of our own world and our own thinking, because thinking changes. We change, and thinking changes, and norms change. And I'm frightened by sort of fundamentalist ideas about what plays we may or may not, or should not think about or consider.
Interesting. Well, just one other question in this vein, because it does, I've been around long enough to remember when even OSF and ACT, they did the sort of the classical repertory, right? And that seems to have vanished most theaters. Do you see the Guthrie? It seems as you're committed, it seems to me, at the Guthrie, trying to maintain some connection to that past while also doing a lot of new work. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's fair to say. It's absolutely, in any given season at the Guthrie, in very rough terms and plus or minus depending on the year, I'd say roughly half the work is coming from the classical canon writ large. If you want to use TCG's framing, I would say half our work in any given year is a classic work. And of course we are, committed to new voices and new plays. And when we make those classic plays, I become very interested in through whose lens do we see them? Who's the director? Who's the scenic designer, costume designer, lighting designer, choreographer, fight director, speech coach, etc. I think, look, those plays belong to all of us. If you can go to any 10th grade classroom in this country, any 10th grade classroom, and if you were to ask that class, as a class, tell me the story of Romeo and Juliet, pretty much 100% of 10th grade classes could tell you the story of that play. We all own that story. We all own that story. And so I get real interested in who gets to make it. Whose voice, whose experience, artistically, life experience is, through whose lens do we get to view these plays becomes very important to us at the Guthrie, and indeed who's playing those roles.
Well, that's interesting. Going back to the question about do we need Shakespeare, and the way of framing that question that I've heard is Shakespeare really for everybody? Because the claim has been made for quite a long time, centuries, that Shakespeare is for everyone. And some people have disputed that. It's interesting because a moment ago you said not everyone likes Shakespeare and everyone likes musicals. So I think, from an audience standpoint, it's true that there are some people who are never going to warm to Shakespeare. From the perspective of the practitioner or the participant, on the other hand, I would say, from things I know that you've said and I've heard you say, that Shakespeare is for everyone in that sense. It's anyone can do it. It belongs to everybody. Can anyone do it? Of course, everyone can do it, in the same way that everyone should play basketball, because it's a fun game and you get good exercise, but nobody wants to pay to watch me play basketball. So I think there is also something to be said, and I think we minimize our art form enormously if we just go, everybody can do it, and everybody can do it in the same way and on the same level, which is categorically untrue. It takes a lot of years to just not be embarrassing, let alone be very, very good. And there are plenty in our field who spend their lives trying to learn to be as skilled
There's a craft question, to be sure. So it is for everybody. And when I make Henry V with 10 maximum security inmates, I'm measuring success by a different metric than if I'm making Henry V on the Elizabethan stage at OSF. Not that one is more valuable than another, but you're measuring it by a different yardstick, to be sure. To be sure. The idea of Shakespeare, like I think Shakespeare, like I think everybody should love it as much as I do, and I think everybody should participate. Of course I do. But what are we talking about? Like nobody loves everything. Nobody does. I mean, there are even people who don't like Ted Lasso, as bewildering as that is to me. So I think, we talk about, again, the field goes, it's like, well, how do we capture the Latino community to come and watch our work? I'm like, we haven't captured any community. Some 3% of white adults in this country go to theater on a regular basis. We haven't captured any community, but it's an art form, and we make that art for people who may be interested in it and who feel enriched by it. And in that way, I think that's beautiful. And I think Shakespeare's for a lot of people, but Shakespeare's not for everybody, because some people don't like it. And that's fine and fair. I don't know. There are people I won't say them here because I don't want to out myself. But there are plays that I'll produce at the Guthrie that I believe in, because I believe that there's a community that is going to love that play, but not necessarily because I love that play. There are things that I love and resonate with me, and there are playwrights and plays that simply don't as much. And that's not how I curate a season. It doesn't have to please me deeply. If I'm making it a show, of course, but if I'm not, I can be fully persuaded that there's a play that our community would really, really dig into and love, that I can appreciate, I admire, but I'm not, like, I personally don't love it. And I think that's got to be true of Shakespeare as well. So I guess, like, why do we need everyone to love it? Like, why does it have to be for everyone? And what is? I mean, literally, what is? I don't know. I can't think of a single thing, a single piece of art, a single play, a single piece of music, where the response is absolutely uniform and that everybody is crazy about. It just doesn't exist. So I'm not sure what we're talking about when we have those particular conversations,
Mm-hmm. Well, but your comments about programming and how you might be disposed to produce something that you expect a certain segment of your viewership will like, even if it's not to your taste, that kind of brings up the question I wanted to ask you. Was close enough anyway. I feel invited to ask it. Just has to do with, there really are some people who, as much as they may declare themselves Shakespeare fans, nevertheless think that maybe some of his plays just shouldn't be produced anymore. Now, I think I know what your answer to this is probably going to be, but nevertheless, I do want to ask it, because I have heard the argument made by serious-minded people, by lovers of the art, that, well, it's maybe time to let go of Taming of the Shrew. It's time to let go of The Merchant of Venice, maybe even Othello. What would you say to that?
I'd say that I'm opposed to book burnings of every type. I just am. It's no better on the left than it is on the right. I'm not in favor of censorship. I'm not in favor of saying we must always or never do anything. I think this correlates with everything I've said to, like, fundamentalists scare me. They just do. And they scare me as much on the left as they do on the right. It's frightening to me that anyone feels that they have the moral clarity to be able to declare what is and is not available for examination. I'm not sure that there isn't a really important production of Taming of the Shrew to be made. I'm not sure that there isn't a really important production of Merchant of Venice to be made. Do I need to see productions that were made 50 years ago that are to our time right now, I wouldn't suggest for a moment we should be doing it that way. But if we're saying, let's put aside that material because we mustn't examine that material anymore, I have enormous misgivings. I mean, again, it's personal opinion, I admire that others may feel very differently about it than I do. As a non-white person who has spent a lot of time around those plays speak volumes to me. I don't have to be white. I don't have to be British. I don't have to be to admire these plays. I don't love the plays because I was indoctrinated from an early age. And the only reason I like Shakespeare is because it was driven down my throat since 5th grade, because I didn't read one until grad school. I just love the plays. And I think we ought, just as we say with people, we ought to let people love who they love, and we ought to let people love what they love. And if somebody has a really great idea for how to make a production of even the thorniest of Shakespeare's plays, I'm open to that conversation, and I'd like to have it. And I'd like to think that there's a way of making it look, in recent years at the Guthrie, I've directed South Pacific, a hugely problematic play in today's world. And I think we solved for some things in terms of how to make that piece now. We made that West Side Story, and again, all my cues come from the script. On the very first page of West Side Story, it says the Sharks are Puerto Rican and the Jets are an amalgam of what it means to be American, which is to say the Jets are not a homogenous white group. I mean, there's a character called Arab in there, for heaven's sakes. So in our view and in our production, we saw fit that the Jets were whether they're Italians or the Polish or the Arabs, they're folks from earlier generations who are equally reviled as the Puerto Ricans are, who are now assimilated, who hate the new people who are coming in because we're always afraid of the new other. And so it was a framing for the play that allowed us to wrestle with some of the very things that are most problematic about it. And again, I just think there are a lot of plays like that are very problematic. And you're out of your mind if you think you were just going to make them, close your eyes and make them the way they might have been made in whatever year that they arrived in the world. But they're great. And they hold enough that they're strong enough, they're tensile enough that you can dig in and you can do some things with them and to them and for them that can bring forward much of what is brilliant about it and reflect the moment and the universe in which we live. And I think there's great value in that exercise.
And that brings up another question I really was hoping I could ask you, which just has to do with, and I guess it's related to that basic question of is our feelings about Shakespeare different than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, which is, does the particular historical moment we're in dictate a greater freedom to recontextualize? Or how do you, because I know you're very text-centric, how do you kind of find your way between the need to refurbish and recontextualize and your commitment to the text?
Yeah, I am a text centrist, and which is to say that even the biggest ideas that show up in any of the Shakespeare plays that I've directed, they're all ignited from the text, all of them, all of those ideas, and sometimes they take me to places that are unexpected, maybe, or things that we've not seen in a lot in other productions, for example. I'm trying to think of an example that I could offer. It's a way of saying, David, I don't ever set out to go, I'm making Hamlet. I have to think of 5 new things so that it's different than other Hamlets people have seen. I never, ever think that way. I just read it and read it and read it. And I see what awakens my own imagination and my own mind. And these plays, which contain multitudes, you're always choosing, they have an A, a B, a C, a D storyline, and you're always choosing which you want to maybe diminish a bit, which you want to elevate some, etc. There are people who make a Hamlet who are super interested in the Fortinbras track and what the political situation. There are others who get rid of as much of that as is possible because they're focusing on another piece of it, right? And so I don't set out to try to make something that would feel brand new to everybody. And it's not new because you do it with somebody in a Trump wig or because you put it in a plexiglass box. And that doesn't, again, that could be beautiful or not beautiful, but it's not solving the play. It gets solved through, of course, the text itself and what are the themes, what is being examined and explored. And sometimes that can lead you to wonderful, wonderful places. But I don't set out to think about how do I contextualize this or recontextualize this for our own world. I live in our own world. So I'm reading it as a human who participates in this current moment. And so there are things that rise and feel that vibrate for me, that feels, oh gosh, this is interesting. Today, this is interesting. People sometimes ask me the question, like, what's your favorite Shakespeare play? And I guess I have opinions, but more I'm interested in when we are making this play. Like we have right now at the Guthrie, we opened The Tempest a couple of weeks ago, and I programmed The Tempest because I felt it was such an important play for right now. Its themes of forgiveness, its themes of the movement of that play from a clenched fist to an open hand felt to me that it had such currency in today's moment and what an audience may want or need now. And I curate from that point of view, and I certainly make plays from that point of view.
It's interesting about your phrase, solving, I think you said solving the play, which brings up another question in my mind, that I think must face practitioners in 2022. Are there we just mentioned a few plays that some people just want to dismiss from the boards altogether. But do you feel there are some scripts that are more problematic? You're always solving the play, but in some ways, are you solving a play that historical circumstances have rendered uniquely problematic?
That's a great question. It's a really great question. When I say solving the play, just to be very clear, I don't mean anything except meaning for me. I don't think you solve the play. I don't think anybody has the play, the production of any of these plays. I had this amazing experience when I directed Hamlet at the Folger in 2010. And I'm sure the folks on this call are probably deeply conversant. The Folger Theater sits atop the vault, 4 floors above the vaulted space, which holds the largest collection of first folios in the world. And when we were doing Hamlet, the Folger Library treated the company the opportunity to be able to go down into the vaults and look at this extraordinary trove of Shakespeare texts and history. And they were like, and we went down and they're like, here's our Hamlet row. And there they are. They're the prompt scripts of John Barrymore's Hamlet and Keane's Hamlet and in that white gloved way that they'll show you pages, like the margins are filled, and they're filled with, these are actors and theater makers just doing what we do now, which is trying to understand, trying to solve, or trying to figure out how to tell this story. And I found it to be such a great comfort because it really, I don't know, we were maybe halfway into rehearsals, maybe slightly more, with all the anxieties that pertain. And I thought, oh, this is it. There's nothing absolute here. It's a river, and you get into this river of all of these Hamlets that have come before, and with a foreknowledge of all of the Hamlets that will come later. And you get in the river and you swim for a bit and you add your small contribution to its thinking, whatever, and you get back out and somebody else does it. So like when people just go crazy about, oh my God, that Julius Caesar, that was the word, or how could you ever make Midsummer? They're like, who cares? Wait 30 minutes. You're going to see another one. These things aren't final in any way. And I just find that to be a great comfort to know that, like, I do not have to save the play Hamlet's reputation. I have no response. I can get in, I can make the play, I can be done making the play. Somebody else will make it differently, better, worse from one person or another's point of view. And it's not what's important. What's important is that you're making that play with brilliant collaborators and your designers and your actors, all who are doing the same wrestling with that text that you're doing. And between you come to a collective understanding of what this production of this play is going to be. And then opening night comes and you share that with the world. And then closing night comes and they throw the thing out. And it's the ephemera of the art form itself. And it lives in the memories of those who have seen it and for whom it meant something too. And it moves on. And I sometimes think about Shakespeare, what they often say about the Academy. The battles are so fierce because the stakes are so low. I mean, nobody's doing any harm to Shakespeare. He's fine. He, she, they are fine. Nothing bad's going to happen. Make the play. It's in the public domain. The only reason we're still doing Shakespeare 450 years out is because we can do them however we want to do them. And you don't have, the Beckett estate telling you how Godot ought to be made, which isn't helpful.
That's great. Thank you. Well, curious to know, it sounds that, your text centricity notwithstanding, that you're, I think, saying that anything goes in a way, right? That in a way, maybe the text, as much as it may be your pole star, if you see something that suggests to you that they didn't really get it, weren't as faithful to the text, or they didn't read it as scrupulously as they ought to have, that nevertheless they made a theatrical event that one can like or not like, and perhaps saying, well, it wasn't, they deviated too much from the text, wouldn't, in your judgment, be a valid lament?
No, I don't care. I mean, look, I just be real clear. There are things I like and there are things I don't like. It's not like I don't have overly strong opinions about things that I see. I just think it's okay. Like, I don't think anybody has to come for permission to the Shakespeare gods to do whatever they want to do with these plays. Sometimes things are gotten in my view, so right and so beautiful that I can hardly believe how sublime it is. And other times it feels idiotic in the extreme. But that is nothing but my opinion, and I think we'd all do well to just go. That's how I felt about it, and like I don't need to get on Facebook and make my declarations to the whole world about the wrongness of an approach or how they're doing it. How the approach is, the translations of Shakespeare that are much talked about now, whatever that word might mean, from English to English. I as far as I'm concerned, people can do whatever they want. As far as the law is concerned, one can do anything they want. And when we apply orthodoxies to Shakespeare, we are not applying Shakespeare's intent. We're applying ours. We're applying ours, period. When people say, I prefer my Shakespeare traditional. What are we even talking about? 450 years ago traditional, so we shouldn't have women on the stage, or we should take down the lights, or are we saying traditional as in you want to see a costume show, Elizabethan or Renaissance or whatever you think it is? Mostly what people are saying when they say that is, I want Shakespeare the way it was when I first encountered it. And I'm now 72 years old, and I encountered Shakespeare first in whatever, and I expect you to look and sound like John Gielgud, and you don't. And that's problematic for me. But you're not solving for Shakespeare. You're solving for you. And again, it's fine. People can have the opinions that they want. I really get angry when I don't care on what level. If you've gone to see a play, you're watching something that people have worked months and maybe years on. And the art form and those artists deserve greater honor than being slagged off publicly in every direction for that play not comporting to your view about what that play ought to be or should be. And for as cruel as our field can sometimes, for as cruel as it can be in our field, because we open things up, and of course there's critical response, whether that's an individual or whether that's the New York Times, there's a critical response, and we accept that and we know that. but it is nothing next to the damage that we do to one another as professionals in our field, when we bring forward our own fundamentalism, our own certainty, our own smug sureness of what things ought to be or ought not to be.
Great, thank you. Maybe this is a good segue to asking some questions about your own productions. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm sure there were people watching either now or later who saw your productions at OSF. I'm thinking of the Henry V, very memorable production, and the most memorable moment for me was when King Henry actually personally executed his old tavern buddy, Bardolph. And I know that was a moment that really shocked a lot of people and maybe had some people scratching their heads a little bit. I wondered if you wouldn't mind talking about that moment and how you arrived at that and how it fit into the trajectory of the storytelling in that production.
Well, I think, again, it's all, for me, it all came out of how I understand the text itself. We have Henry V at the top of that play. We know, Shakespeare's audience would have known, and we're told at the top of Henry V, for anybody who doesn't know, that this was a dissolute youth, was as far from the throne and the crown and responsibility as is humanly possible. He disgraced himself and his father, in some people's view, for how, the kind of young life that he had. And from the very beginning of that play, he gets tested. Are you different now than who you were? Not just the Dauphin, the French testing him, but his own people. Where is he? How far along is he? What's going on? Henry, out loud in the play, says, it'll be death to anybody in my troops who steals anything or does any harm to any of these French villages as we're moving through. He makes that edict. Somebody comes to him in the play and says, oh, wow, we survived that battle. Exeter, I think, says, we survived that battle. Everything's fine, except for one guy who was caught robbing packs of little price across something of almost no value. His best pal, one of his best pals from his tavern days, is the guy who stole that thing. And Henry has to make a decision there about whether or not he executes his friend. And I thought, that's often handled as an offstage hanging. It is sometimes handled as an execution that happens in the room, but somebody else, Exeter or somebody else, accomplishes. And I thought, that's a test. He's got all his men there. Everybody's staring at him to see what he's going to do. And is he going to give his friend a pass? And in our production, Bardolph was brought in with his hands tied behind his back. He's pushed to his knees. Henry crosses over to him, goes behind him, unties him. We think perhaps for the moment that he's going to be giving Bardolph a pass because he happens to be, a best friend of Henry's. And then with the very cords with which Bardolph's hands were tied, he puts them around Bardolph's neck and strangles him in real time. And it takes a long time to strangle somebody. So the idea of that and the idea of what leadership means and what must be sacrificed in order for him to be legitimate in that role, I thought there would be hardly better evidence of that and what he was prepared to do to show that were it my brother, were it my friend, whoever it is not above the law and is not beyond the law. And I thought it to be a way to demonstrate that theme of the play. And, I think in order for Henry V to not play as only a patriotic love song to everything English and that history, I wanted to show that whether Henry V is a pro-war or anti-war play is somebody else's question, I expect. I think in my reading of the Shakespeare, it's not pro or anti-war. It's simply there to reflect the cost of war if you choose to wage it. And the cost is terrible. And it is most terrible for the person who finally carries the burden of all those folks who are sent to their deaths through that. So that's an awfully long answer to your very short question, but that's how I got there.
No, it's a great answer. And
and I'll also say it was hard to persuade John Tufts, who played Henry V, to do it, because anybody who's playing Henry V, and I've played it, you kind of want to be the hero of the thing, and there's something so obviously not heroic about that. And I don't want to overstate this, because John certainly came around, and he was beautiful, I think, in that role. But there are a lot of folks who didn't love the impulse initially.
Well, I do have to tell you, it's one of the moments in the theater that I'll just never forget. I guess that's why I brought it up. I think of that production. There are many things I remember about the production. It was powerful, but that one was just one of those moments. The night I saw it, I don't know if this happened every time, but when King Henry took the ropes off Bardolph's hands, he kind of like patted him on the shoulder, even on the head. Yeah. And I just remember Brent Hinckley getting this look on his face like, oh, I'm not going to die after all. And actually kind of looking back up at Hal with this kind of loving expression on his face. So then when Henry proceeded to execute him, it was just, well, it got me where I lived. I haven't forgotten it, clearly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about now, as I mentioned in my introduction, I don't think I was exaggerating. Well, I mean, I suppose word of mouth is never a totally reliable barometer of a production's popularity, but I heard from an awful lot of people about how much they love Pericles. And I don't want to sort of say, why do they love it so much? Because it was a beautiful production. But I do happen to know, again, from things I've heard you say elsewhere, that you're just such a big believer in the play itself. And I remember hearing you talk before the production even happened about its particular virtues. And I'm just wondering if, I know, even though you've addressed it in the past, maybe some people have heard you talk about it, if you could mention again what you find to be so wonderful about the script that, as you have noted in the past, academics have sometimes just dismissed as kind of an embarrassing late experiment that Shakespeare botched.
Yeah, I think scholars talk about that play one way. I think people who make that play in another way. It's, almost all of Shakespeare's plays, for me, they read so well. The job is like, how do you get it to life? Pericles doesn't read well. It just doesn't. That thing doesn't make any sense at all outside of production, which is, I think, why it makes it real hard from a study point of view as text. I really understand folks' ambivalences about it, but it's astounding how often that play works in production, not just mine. I was very pleased for the success of our production, and we ran it for 10 months, I think, at OSF. It then played at the Folger Theater for some time, and then it was my first show at the Guthrie. And the idea that play could have a 18-month run of this 450-year-old play, which everybody thinks is terrible, was amazing. And and the fact that somebody like Peter Marks, who writes for the Washington Post, on his top 10 list in 2015, which included Hamilton, included our production of Pericles. And so I just loved the fact that we could burnish in our own tiny way the reputation of this much maligned play. Here's how I think of it. I think those last four plays of Shakespeare's, to the extent that we understand them to be perhaps the last four, the romance plays of Cymbeline, which I confess to not understanding well enough, but certainly Winter's Tale, Pericles, and The Tempest are. I think they're parables. They're not, when people are like, well, I don't get it. Like, people don't come back to life. People aren't resurrected. It's like this. You're missing the entire point. In Winter's Tale, like, she's not really a statue, right? Like Paulina's hidden her away for all these years, and now is bringing her out, pretending she's a statue. And I'm like, no, in my view, I think you're missing the whole game. I think she's a statue, and I think she comes back to life, because those plays are parables, and I think it's interesting to think about Pericles in relation to Winter's Tale, and I think we can talk about it here because your group are folks who I'm certain are knowledgeable of both those plays. I think it's very worth thinking of those two plays in relation to one another. In my view, Winter's Tale is which carries much of the same architecture of Pericles in some ways, right? Father, wife, daughter, who's lost, who comes back, all those things. But but structurally, what's the word? The approach is very different. In Winter's Tale, Leontes does a very it's a Christian play. Leontes does he commits a terrible sin, and he goes through his period of remorse, goes through his penitence. Having been seen to be sufficiently penitent, what was lost is then restored. In my view, Pericles is a still more mature play, because in the real world, bad things don't just happen to bad people, and good things don't just happen to good people. In the real world, and for any life lived for any length of time, there is astounding beauty to be found, and a hardly survivable tragedy, which we will all face along a journey of a life that is long. And I actually think in this late play of Pericles, that's what Shakespeare, I think, is examining. Pericles doesn't do anything wrong to lose everything. He doesn't do anything particularly right to get it all back. It's how the universe goes. And there's something so beautiful about that to me. And I think something about that, I think, is why in production, that play often works. The play often works because I think we feel that and that journey as somehow true. And those first acts, which everybody says are not Shakespeare's, and the late acts, which people think might be Shakespeare's, in my non-academic, non-scholarly view, I feel the eyes rolling so hard in our Zoom universe right now. I feel like Shakespeare wrote all of it, and I think those early acts are purposefully two-dimensional. As Pericles himself is young and coltish, he's got a plan. He's going to go to Antioch. He's going to marry the girl. He's going to have 2.5 kids. He's got a plan. And, we know what they say about plans, right? Like the universe has its own idea about how things are going to play out. And so the thinness of those scenes, I think, correlate to Pericles' own youth and immaturity. And he's young and coltish. He has all the answers, not enough of the information. He goes out and tries to force the world that he wants. And then indeed, he ends up with the world that he gets. And I think that play is, it's a search for home, not just his journey to return to Tyre, but spiritually, it's a return or journey to home, to self, to I recognize I'm boring everyone at this point. I love the play entirely. I think it's a piece of astounding. I think it's a piece of astounding beauty, and I love that company at OSF, and I count that experience amongst the small handful of my very favorite experiences with a play and with a company.
I doubt you were boring anyone. You certainly weren't boring me. I happen to be a huge fan of Pericles myself, so I could hear you talk all day about it. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about your other production at OSF, Midsummer Night's Dream, which, again, we talk about memorable moments. Which, on the one hand, in Henry V, that sort of shocking execution. And for Midsummer, I think for me anyway, it was the ending in which suddenly the whole play was really, I hope I'm not misrepresenting your intentions by saying it seemed as though the whole play was in a way directed towards, or it was a tribute to a particular married couple. Do I have that right? I mean, that's that.
Yeah, it was, well, the research and the text was interesting to me. And Midsummer and The Tempest, I believe, are the only two plays of Shakespeare that are not coming from another source. It seems to have been fully conceived by Shakespeare, whoever she, he, or they may have been. And in that research, finding out there's a lot we don't know about that play and its early production. But what we seem to know is that it was written for a wedding. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. It's written for a wedding. And I thought, well, then maybe this play is an examination of love, of partnered love, and there is in the young lovers, we get all of the heat and appetite of young love. In Theseus and Hippolyta, we get a kind of forced marriage of a kind that is going on. In Oberon and Titania, you see an extraordinarly mature love, right? One that's been going on for eternity in this fairy kingdom, and the challenge of relationship over time. And then with Bottom and Titania, you have the affair, the thing that's happening outside of wedlock, the desire for something else or something different, in the loneliness of Bottom, who is seeking, who would love to have a kind of love relationship, which is perhaps not in Bottom's cards. And so seeing it through that lens made it really interesting to me. So we bookended that production for anybody who didn't see the 3 performances that we played before we were shut down. And I'm eager to make it again. I really want to have another go at it, at OSF or elsewhere. So we framed the show around, we had the actor who plays Helena is musical, and she came out with the ukulele, and she sang a little ditty, a kind of prologue to the show, and then she actually tells the audience, sort of preamble to the show, gives basically the post-show talk pre-show, which is to say, hey, do you all know this play was apparently written for a wedding? And that's the thing. How many of you here have been married? How many of you are partnered here? Who's here with a partner? They raise their hand. And how many of you have been in a relationship for 5 years or less, and then 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, and somebody's there, a couple. And every evening, our actor playing Helena would choose one of these couples and just say, and again, it's all very conversational. And she'd say, oh, my God, you've been together 35 years. How did you meet? And she'd say, oh, we met this way and whatever. And it's kind of funny and whatever. And it's like, and what did you know about him then? And what are the thing? And what did you think about her and him? And sometimes it was with a same-sex couple, and sometimes otherwise. And she would just ask a bunch of questions, and she's having a fun conversation. And then Phyllis Drake comes on and shoos her off stage because we have to start the show. Well, then we had Helena, who had learned these things from this sort of interview of a kind with a couple in the thing. And she wrote when she was off stage and not playing Helena, she would write a new song every night and come out at the end of the show. And she would sing that song about this couple and how they met and their thing or whatever. And it was printed out on this little show, and we gave it to them as a gift. So it wasn't about a gift to only that couple each night, but it was a way to share that the play is an examination of all of the joys and challenges and tribulations of partnered relationship. And I enjoyed the framing enormously. And with my great colleague, Jack Herrick, who had done the music for Pericles, I had also done the Hamlet that I'd done at the Folger, did the music for it. And I'm eager to have another go. I really am. I think it's an interesting way to think about that play.
What's sort of interesting and ironic and poignant really is that, having seen it, it had such a sort of outward looking, community affirming, community building energy about it, and ending with the sort of affirmation of a communal recognition of a marriage that was the subject of the play. And to have COVID shut it down, I mean, not to dwell on it, but COVID shutting it down. And then we all sort of suffered, among other things, a loss of community at that point. And that seems to be particularly sad. Again, not to dwell on it, but you made this production that instead of being able to run for 9 months to kind of continue to celebrate community was shut down in the wake of a pandemic that made communal gathering almost impossible, or in fact, for a while was impossible.
Perhaps. I mean, you've named the very thing. I mean, there's been so much. I mean, obviously, in the whole world, so much loss, so much grief over it. And in our field, I think the grief is very deep because, for many of us, this work is not just what we do, it's who we are. And not being able to be that for our communities and being in community in the way you described, David, has been, it's been monstrous and really difficult.
Well, it's nice that things are in full swing again. You had a full season, I believe, didn't you, that got through this year? Or you're still in the process of?
We're in the process of rebuilding. We have a sort of abbreviated season this year, and next year we'll be back in full swing of things. We hope so. That's exciting.
That's great. Well, I'm wondering if we have any questions to consider. I said at the outset of the event that Finley would read the questions, but actually Finley instructed you and me, I believe, that we would be able to hear him. So if there are any questions, Finley will relay them to us and then we'll repeat them.
Great.
Okay, that's fine. I'm wondering, if you don't mind, I want to go back to your comparison between The Winter's Tale and Pericles. Been doing a bit of reading about performances of The Winter's Tale in the last decade or so, and one of the things that seems to have happened is that there's a kind of a trend, and I doubt it's a case of directors reading reviews of other productions and deciding, oh, I'm going to do that, although maybe who knows. But there's a recurrent choice to bring Mamilius, Leontes' lost son. I'm sure, again, as you mentioned a moment ago, that our viewership, our listeners probably know the play, so maybe I don't have to explain about that. But the point is that a lot of productions bring Mamilius back, the ghost of Mamilius back, primarily seems to have the effect, as noted by reviewers, of kind of canceling what in the past has been a sort of, if not transcendent, then at least a deeply poignant ending that accentuates the recovery of what's been lost and seems to affirm the possibility of forgiveness and the possibility of second chance. And I just wonder, going back to your contrast between Pericles, the spiritual play, and The Winter's Tale, the religious one, if that idea of forgiveness, especially for a deranged sexist patriarch, is hard to come by these days. And I'm just so curious to pick your brain. Because it's occurred to me that choice seems to suggest that we're no longer comfortable with just letting the bastard king get away with it, and that we're interested in accountability than forgiveness. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you've got to go back to the ignition point of the play, and the late great dramaturg Leon Katz, who he was on the search committee that hired me to Playmakers back in 2006, and he was already in his late 80s, I think, then, and he was on faculty at UNC. And so the great joy for me was that I would have these every few weeks. He and I would go to breakfast where I would ask him all kinds of idiotic questions to which he would provide magnificent answers. And on one morning of asking idiotic questions, I was like, well, what happens with Leontes? Like, why does he lose his mind? Like, why? He clearly loves his wife. He clearly loves his best friend. What's he seeing? What happens that he all of a sudden is utterly certain that his wife has betrayed him and that his best friend has betrayed him? Like, why? And of course, Leon, being Leon, said, yeah, no, Shakespeare's not interested in the least. The play begins, once upon a time, there was a king who lost his mind. And that's what happened. So the question of I struggle with the basic premise of, like, is Leontes just this bastard, monster, horrible person, or is he a person like you and I are a person who, for whatever reason, does a horrific thing? And does that make him a horrific person? Should his wife never be returned, let alone his son? I mean, should none of that ever happen if he's, but so I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What if Leontes is actually not a horrible guy who happens to have a super horrible day or week or 10 days or whatever the span of time, I'm not remembering now, between his, the beginning of the rage of jealousy and those outcomes. Maybe he's a monster. Maybe he is. And I think that that's a production to be made. And I think also maybe he's not. Having made work with those maximum security guys, one of the most startling things that happens if you go inside. This was at the a facility in California, in the corner of the Mojave Desert, and these guys were all doing 35 to life. And one of the startling things that happen when you go in is you go, oh, these aren't people you'd look at from 50 yards and go, that's a monster. Stay away from that guy. Like, no, it was so clear so quickly that the difference between who we are and who they are is a difference of degree, not of kind. And so I think there's an interesting question, which maybe then answers, is it, how do you earn the son's return if you want it at the end of the play? What might be another way of asking about that question of having Mamillius return at the end of the play. Like, if we don't feel it to be earned, then it's kind of gross. If we feel it to somehow have been earned through Leontes' journey across the play, maybe it makes a kind of sense. It wouldn't be my impulse to bring Mamillius, but really, who cares? The question is, holistically within the production, do we receive that gesture as one that does something beautiful for us, or does it sit in difficult axis to what we've been watching all evening? So I think it's like, it's the 2 hours and 40 minutes prior to that moment which probably matter most as related to the question of does it make sense for Mamillius to return?
It is interesting how many students I come across or people I come across, and I feel like I'm coming across them more frequently than I used to, who just sort of say, oh, Leontes, he's such a rat bastard, right? He's such an example of toxic masculinity, and I find it really hard to care about him, let alone forgive him. And I just, again, in my very unscientific way, I feel as I'm hearing that more. And actually, let's check back with Finley. Any questions, Finley? Okay. I'm thinking about King Lear, which you directed. And I do hear some of the things, maybe not quite as many, maybe not as vociferously, but some of the same complaints about Lear. Oh, why should I care? He's this raging, egocentric patriarch, who mistreats people and thinks the world owes him everything. And I don't know if that even occurred to you when you worked on the play, if there was some way you needed to sort of make a case for him, or if, again, it's just, no, we don't have to anticipate the skeptics or the cynics or the naysayers. It's just, let's do the play.
I think you just do the play. And I think, Lear, the character of Lear, I think is enormously complicated. I just think he's an enormously complicated human being. And I think that's what, it seems to me, it's what Shakespeare's trying to put on the page. I don't think, again, you're circling these characters, right? The Leontes of the world, the Lears of the world, the Hamlets of the world, for that matter. Those characters are enormously complex, just like the rest of us. It's not hard for me to understand how somebody who ran a kingdom and maybe ran it really well for quite some time no longer can run it well, is furious at his failing gifts, none of this is hard for me to understand on human terms. Like, it's just not at all. And so, I just kind of figure out how to do those things. I really don't think much good happens in a rehearsal room if you sort of go around the room and go, good character, bad character, villain, hero. Nothing good happens. Nobody wants to see those plays. I'm not here to defend Leontes and all his actions in the play. He does an astoundingly horrible thing. Why he does it? Maybe Leon Katz is right. No, we're not to care. What we'd see is that he does it, and what becomes interesting to us is what he does about it the rest of the evening, and that maybe is what is important. I think in a production that doesn't find a journey from Leontes, from rat bastard, patriarchal, garbage human, if you don't chart a path, there's no way Paulina brings Hermione back out. There's no way she does. She makes real clear from the jump she couldn't care less about Leontes' power. Her fealty and her love belongs to Hermione. And she would never bring Hermione back unless she believed entirely in some idea around restorative justice around Leontes' journey in the play and who he becomes by that last act in order for that gesture to be plausible and not just make us vaguely nauseous.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that. I'm wondering too, reading a review of your production of King Lear, I couldn't help but note that at least one critic called attention to the fact that in your production, Lear kills the fool. And I have to be honest, as soon as I read that, I thought back to the woman in Henry V.
Somebody kills everyone in every play. It doesn't matter. The music man, somebody dies.
Well, again, a very bold choice. And having, I mean, not you, I don't want to make you go through the creative process and the decision-making that led to that choice. I wouldn't mind it. But it did strike me as just certainly something I'd never seen before or considered before, and so I guess I wouldn't mind your talking a little bit about it.
Yeah, I wish I'd thought about this a little bit because I don't remember what scene. I remember the scene. I just couldn't tell you what scene in the play it is. It's after the storm when Lear and the fool and Edgar have found shelter somewhere. And it's, again, for me, it's simply from the text. The fool leaves the play at that moment, gone for the rest of the play. Shakespeare says at the end, my fool's dead, or my fool's gone, whatever, something. But we don't see him. And I'm like, well, who accounts for the fool? What happens to the fool? And I thought maybe that's not an open question. And maybe Lear is raging in that scene, and maybe in his delirium and in his dementia, he actually kills somebody that he loves. So I guess it is a bit like the Henry V thing. So they were in a kind of shed in our production, and he has a screwdriver, is talking about the knaves and the things, and he stabs the fool who dies on stage. I know at least in Sam Mendes' production at the National with Simon Russell Beale, I think Lear also beats the fool to death or something. I think that also happened there. It's as you say, like I really don't think people go around copying other people's work. I think there are things, for whatever reason, it's funny how this works. There's certain things that just emerge where several productions or several things are approaching things in the same way, or an idea that hasn't been had before is now being had by several folks. And I think that happens a lot in our game. I really do.
Okay, Finley, checking back with you.
Oh, it's so sweet. I only need to be invited. I love the play. I love the organization, and it would be an honor.
That was, if I'm understanding Finley's instructions at the top of the event.
Oh, he can't. I really can't. Sorry.
But I was just going to say an expression of thanks from someone who is watching, and I think gratitude and admiration, and expressing a wish that Joe would come back and direct again, and with any luck, Midsummer Night's Dream. So go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, no, that's it. And my response to that, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, I had forgotten that not everybody could hear the question, was that, yeah, I'd be honored to. I love OS. I love that organization a great deal. I really do. And I'm excited for its future, and I'd love to have. I'm going to have another go at that Midsummer. So at OSF or elsewhere, I want to have another go at it.
Great. Well, I want to ask you about Romeo and Juliet. There are many questions I'd love to ask you about that. But I want to start with the fact that you paired, I don't know how much time elapsed from your production of Romeo and Juliet to the West Side Story. Maybe it was a few months, but I was just struck by what was clearly a tremendous success, popularity of West Side Story, your production of it. On the one hand, of course, West Side Story is this beloved musical. On the other hand, it's very tricky, especially, I think, in this day and age, we all saw what Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner did with it, the extreme efforts they went through to sort of refurbish it and recontextualize it. And so, I guess my question is, to what extent does the great success of the West Side Story owe something to your exploration of the source?
Absolutely. We made them in the same season, and I directed both productions. And this was very conscious, of course, that we would, in a given season, put them together, put them in a way in conversation with each other. So we opened our thrust season, which is our 1,100 seat sort of signature room, with Romeo and Juliet. And then we closed the thrust season that summer with West Side Story. And yeah, there's a lot from those, the folks who made West Side Story studied R&J pretty well. It's smart. It's very smart how it builds on the structure and shape of it. And one of the central things that learned making Romeo and Juliet, which I repeated over and over to the West Side Story company, is that Romeo and Juliet is feel like if anybody in Romeo and Juliet, if any of those main characters, if anybody took 5 more minutes to really figure something out, they'd make better choices. And they don't. And the responsibility of the production is to take those 5 minutes away. It has to go at such a forward tilt towards its terrible and inevitable conclusion. And if you allow it to sag, if you allow it to get too reflective, if you allow it to get on the back foot, you'll lose in the architecture of R&J is such that that spring just coils and coils and coils and coils all night long. And if you let too much air out of it, I mean, every play, it's not like the whole thing is playing on a rail, but like if you let too much air out of it, you can't reclaim it. And again, the rashness of decisions is what creates those sort of domino effects. And it's absolutely true of West Side Story as well. Absolutely true as well. If those characters had just a little more time to slow things down and think a little harder about it, they'd make different choices than the ones they end up making. I loved working on both of those productions. And as you say, with West Side Story, I mean, it was successful, and as you say, musicals often are, and West Side Story will often be. But there was enormous risk in that production for us. Nobody's interested in West Side Story with a 6-piece band. You need an orchestra. It's a symphonic score. You need 36 actors to do it because you can't double anybody. Sharks can't be jets. Jets can't be sharks. Shark girls can't be jet girls. Jet girls can't be shark. So that you can't double a soul in that piece. So it's gigantic. An enormous expense involved. And we decided we'd make a brand new choreography for it. And we got permission to not use the Robbins choreography, but create our own, which was brilliantly done by Maya Garcia. And so the success of it was hardly a foregone conclusion, but I was so pleased at how, we played that in an 1,100 seat room, 8 shows a week for 3 months, and we sold every single seat, and that's crazy. So we were thrilled by it. It was really fun.
And you weren't in a position, unlike Tony Kushner, you weren't in a position to sort of rewrite it.
Yeah.
So I think that's even more impressive because some of that sort of 50s, that faux juvenile delinquent 50s lingo is hard to get by. So
that play was on my bucket list. That musical's been on my bucket list forever. And I only had one. There was really, before I'd thought of any of the other things about it or new choreography or how to handle it, just like, I want to see one production of this musical where I can believe these guys as gang members. That's what I want. Because, in the movie and the thing that's like, they're gang members, but mostly they're guys you'd be happy to bring home to mom. I mean, they seem lovely in almost every way. And I wanted folks you could believe as a character called Snowboy. I mean, Snow is what is the word euphemism? It's a word we use for heroin. He's a smack addict. Of course he is. And I wanted those things in the play. And, Guthrie's a Lord A theater, and obviously we seek very, very skilled artists for all that we do. I gave 5 actors or 6 actors in that company their equity card. It was their first professional show, and they were magnificent movers and singers, and we helped them do the other things they needed to do, because I wanted folks who could be plausible as gang members.
I was just thinking, I should check back with Finley. Finley, any questions? Wow. I wish I had the ability to quote that verbatim. That's an expression of thanks from someone who actually was part of the married couple that was paid tribute to by Royer and the company of Joe's production of Midsummer. And that last line, what was that last line, Finley, about the wave of love? Let's have that again. The wave of love that swept the audience throughout the performance was astonishing.
I'm so touched by that. Thank you. Thank you. It was a really meaningful experience to be working on that play and that framing and watching that audience at the end of each of those 3 performances we did. There were people weeping every night at a Shakespeare play, and I don't know, it was beautiful to me. Anyway, I'm very touched by the comment, and I thank you, Priscilla, for sharing it so generously. I love that production. I want another go at it. I think we're onto something. I really do.
Well, and I think your concept, in addition to yielding that conclusion that was so moving, also transformed the characterization of Bottom. You alluded to it, without sacrificing the buffoonery, the sort of comic dimension that he's meant to bring, by making him also someone who wants love and has this sort of one brief moment of romantic glory, and then has to face the next day and the reality of
that speech of Bottom's after he wakes from his reverie. Again, if somebody would say to me, "Hey Joe, there's a production of Midsummer. Do you want to go see it?" I will say, when Bottom says, "Methought I was, and methought I had," when he says "methought I had," if he's making a dick joke, I don't need to see that production of Midsummer. And of course, I don't think it is that. It's that he came so close to something that is so beyond that limited human's ability to have relationship. I find it so beautiful. I think it's beautiful. And I thought Dan was gorgeous in it. I really did. And I think playing that for keeps, waking up from that dream where everything was possible, and just sorting through the emotion of it. And then, of course, Bottom being the eternal optimist that he is, like, I know what let's do. Let's write a play. Let's do a thing. We'll play it for the king, and off I go. I find it very dear, very, very dear. And I think that speech it's a journey. And I don't think it's a clown moment. I just don't think it's a clown moment. And again, everybody should make the production the way they want to. But, our feeling was, it's funny, when I talked to Dan, why am I forgetting Dan's last name? Dan Parker. I spoke to Dan about playing it, in the way OSF works, 1.5 years before we made it. And he's like, I don't want to play that role, going out there and making donkey jokes all night. And I was like, Dan, I'm not going to do that. I won't do that to you. I promise you it'll be different if you choose to do this. And I'm very grateful that he wanted to, because I thought he was very beautiful in it. I really do.
Yeah, that his morning after speech was another one of those things I won't forget. So, Finley, anything else? Well, so hopping back, I hope this isn't too crisscrossy to go back to West Side Story, but there was one last question I wanted to ask about that. I was just so struck by your observation that you just sort of opened the play and read the description of the Jets, and immediately had an insight about the sort of heterogeneity of that gang. Were there other moments where just sort of looking with fresh eyes at that script had a similar?
Yeah, this happens to me on a lot of scripts. It just does. Things that I think I know, and I think, oh, maybe it'd be interesting for me to make this play, and then I go in and like all my assumptions end up challenged by actually reading it through the lens or with the foreknowledge that I'm going to be forced to make this play in 6 months' time or 10 months' time or whatever it is. I had this with Hamlet as well, and again, I'm making no declarations about the text, and there are people on this call who know it way better than I do. But there are things that I always assumed to be true about it, that when I got into reading it, I'm like, well, hang on a second. Like, for example, Ophelia's suicide. I've always taken that as fact, but there's one person that witnesses her death, and that one person describes an accident, doesn't describe a suicide. So I was like, okay, so where's the suicide coming from? Oh, I see where it's coming from. The suicide, of course, is we know it's a suicide because later in the play, we find they only want to bury her at nighttime and they don't want to bury her with ritual, which must mean then that she committed suicide. But I'm like, that doesn't necessarily mean that. So then I start going, what's happening in this madness scene? And come to learn that all of the flowers and weeds and herbs and things she talks about are all abortives. And I thought, oh, she dies in that accident having lost her mind, whatever the term might be. And they get the body and she's visible. And in our production, we decided that she's pregnant. That's why she's pregnant. And that's why they're burying her at nighttime. And so in the madness scene, there was a moment where Ophelia revealed, she was wearing sort of a kind of garment that sort of draped in a way that you wouldn't know, but there was a moment where she showed that she was pregnant. And then the way those things knock on through the rest of the play, her death, or the consequence of burying her at nighttime, et cetera, we connected to that. So they're just, it's things like that I just assume are categorically true. And then an examination of the text, they reveal themselves differently to me than what I imagine to be wholly true about the thing. Look, I just made a Christmas Carol this year in a big new production of it. It's a novella that I love. It's a story I love. And in almost every production you see of A Christmas Carol, you see Scrooge as Scrooge being Scrooge, and then the ghosts come and he remains unpersuaded and completely reluctant. And then the last ghost comes like an Old Testament God, scares the hell out of him, and he's like, no, I'll change. But then you go in and you dig in on the thing, it's like, no. Almost from the beginning, Scrooge wants what we all want. He wants to be better. He wants to be made better. He is an agent in his own change. He is telling the second ghost comes in, he says to that ghost, take me with you. I learned something last night that was something that sparked something, and I want to know. I want to like, he wants to change. And so to create a production where Scrooge he doesn't know how, he's terrified of it, all the rest, but he wants what we all want, which is to be made better. And so this happens to me over and over again with plays or things I think I know that I come to know quite differently when I begin to study them,
Great. Well, we're out of time. I've really, really, really enjoyed this conversation. So I can only imagine that those listening now and in the future will enjoy it as well. And I thank you enormously for being here and for sharing your insights about Shakespeare and theater making and et cetera.
It's really been an honor and a pleasure, and I'm delighted to have been invited to come speak with you, David. Thank you for the beautiful questions, and thanks to everyone who participated. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, and we're done, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you.